Thank you for inviting me to address you here today and for hosting. Originally from Toronto, Canada, in case you're wondering why there is no English accent, but because I married an English girl, I am a victim of circumstance. She is, after all, an only daughter, and so invariably I ended up there and have been living there for the last 24 years. Or like I often like to tell people, the Lubavitcher Rebbe told me that Anglo Jewry are a bunch of sinners, and I have to go there to be their punishment. And then I get asked, as I was earlier, do you like living there? Have you ever thought about coming back over here? And my immediate response was, well, I'd have to find what to do over here. I do understand sometime within the last hour there is a job going for police chief in this city, so maybe there's something to think about. Anti-Semitism in London, it's nowhere near as bad as you're given to believe. Probably not as good as I might delude myself into believing, but let's come back to that maybe a little bit later. Let me begin with a certain premise. You know, they tell this wonderful story about these two young Jewish kids who were being bounced from pillar to post. They were very difficult children. No Jewish school could properly discipline them. And so invariably their parents enrolled them into a very staunch, strict, zero-tolerance Christian reformatory school. And as the younger brother is waiting down the hall, the older brother is sitting up in the front, and the principal sitting there in front of him says to him, "Tell me, young man, where is God?" And the boy shifts uneasily in his seat and says nothing. Again, the priest, who happens to be the dean of the school, looks to him and says, "I'm asking you a question, young man. Where is God?" Again, the boy looks down, shifts uneasily, says nothing, at which point the principal comes from around the side of his desk and, taking his large 6'2" frame hovering over this child, looks to him and again says, "One more time, I'm going to ask you, where is God?" At which point the boy jumps out of his seat, runs down the hall, runs bang smack into his younger brother, who says, What is it, man?" He says, "They lost God and they're blaming us." The reason I begin with that anecdote is precisely because there is one argument that is constantly being put out there right now. Notwithstanding anti-Semitism and whatever else, there's always quite a militant atheist group that exists. And the question is being touted about, aren't we better off losing God? Isn't the world better off without religion? Anti-Semitism, racism, terrorism, these are generally all acts being committed in the name of one religion against another. Doesn't that then suggest that religion itself is in essence the root cause of all the malice, and that if we dispelled with religion, then frankly we would have no longer any problems? There would be nothing to hate. Religion, the argument goes, has a corruptive and destructive streak, giving license to the most heinous crimes, and therefore it is best to abolish it. The worst crimes in history have been perpetrated in the name of religion in the West no less than the East, and we Jews know that better than most. The Crusaders, the Inquisition, Martin Luther, pogroms in honor of Easter and Christmas. Aboriginal people throughout the world recall the missionaries standing with the sword and the cross and being told, "Kiss this, or this kisses you." How many wars have been fought and how many atrocities committed in the name of one faith or another? And all, of course, for the glory of God, or with the battle cry of Allah Akbar or what have you. So the question is this: is religion really at fault? Were these criminals truly God's warriors? And to be sure, the easy answer of no, and to simply dismiss them as crazies, ignorant fanatics, or fundamentalists, etc., it's too simplistic a response. But I would suggest to you the following. We're all familiar, of course, with the typical gun debate, within which there is the famous saying, "Guns don't kill, people do." And that is certainly true, though, of course, in the context of the debate, we have to always ponder, nevertheless, do we look to facilitate people? Do we look to make it more readily available to them, etc.? But the basic premise in and of itself remains correct. Nearly everything in life is a double-edged sword with a positive and a negative side. The truth is that just as many people have been killed by following various different secular and social philosophies, or by the propagation of certain theological beliefs, No less destruction has been wrought by scientific research, all kinds of different purposes of colonial pursuit, for conquest, wealth, and so on and so forth. And the point is, it is not this or that premise that is responsible for the consequences as much as what the human mind and so-called rationalism does with it. Are we going to suggest that maybe we should stop thinking? Maybe we should cease scientific pursuits or stop developing social theories and philosophies because of all the death it may have caused? Obviously, that's absurd. Man's greatest gift is the power of free choice. And in order for free choice to operate, a world that can enable a man to make himself into a Moses has to allow, I dare say, for the very real possibility of a man being able to turn himself into a Hitler. And so human reason and the pursuit of religion is not what needs to be changed. Humans have to change by realizing their positive potential and utilizing it for its intended purpose, to make the world into a better place. So it's not religion per se that is the problem. It is people's subjective interpretation, their own rationale, the applied human reasoning that pacifies the conscience and justifies the actions. And so that's just by way of introduction, and with that in mind, now let's go straight to the core of anti-Semitism itself. Its effects, its causes, and what our response ought to be. Let's begin by looking at what I suggest to you is the root cause. And I begin by telling you that I believe that there are essentially two dimensions to anti-Semitism, or two types of haters, if you will. There is the ignorant hater, and there is the malevolent hater. The ignorant hater doesn't really know what Judaism stands for. For some, it's about world dominance. After all, we may speak about the theme of Mashiach, of universal salvation. We talk about universal laws. And historically, that's already being interpreted as looking to try and make the world ours. For others, Judaism, if not supremacy, then certainly superiority, the chosen people complex. Who do we really think we are? And for others, still, the sum total of Judaism is inextricably linked with Israel, which is why whatever happens over there invariably spills out over into the diaspora. And the tragic irony of all this is that Judaism is really the only one faith that insists that you have purpose in who you are and as you are. Yes, we use the term chosen nation. What does that actually mean? It means that our foremost objective is revealing the unity of God within a modern day fragmented society. Judaism was formed because we were given the most crucial charge that humanity has ever been given, and that is to represent to humanity the central point of what makes a human being and how to achieve purpose in life. Hence, Judaism is the one faith that doesn't look to proselytize, that insists that you are as God created you and that you can find true meaning within that role. Unlike other faiths, each which insist that the only way onto heaven is but through them, Judaism says you hold the ticket to heaven in your hands simply by virtue of who you are. And so the ignorant hater essentially finds the Jew annoying. It's like an alien presence in his midst. There's something about the Jewish energy field that agitates, that irritates, something that feels strange and irregular. And that sort of hater invariably coexists with the Jew and tolerates the Jew. And it is only when opportunity lends itself, when it may become fashionable to vent the hatred, when it becomes excusable to boycott, then that same professor who shared the common room with you, or the business colleague who worked with you, or your neighbor who previously greeted you will suddenly rear their ugly side. These are people who can, on the one hand, look upon the Jew with admiration and with affection, or with hate and repulsion, and usually with a mixture of the two. And then there's a deeper dimension to anti-Semitism. You know, Maimonides, the 12th century scholar and philosopher, once explained, citing the words of the Talmud, why was Mount Sinai so called? And the answer is because the word Sinai is a play on a word sinah, which is a Hebrew word meaning hatred. And that in that sense, says the Talmud, when the Jews were proclaimed as God's chosen people at Sinai, then sinah, hatred, came into the world. Did Hitler hate us just because we were different? Well, to put it in his own words, we must destroy the tyrannical God of the Jews and his life-denying Ten Commandments. You see, that moment at Sinai imbued the Jew with a unique sense of ambassadorship, with a great moral and spiritual responsibility. There is something about the Jewish mind, about the Jewish heart, about the Jewish home, about the Jewish family, about the Jewish community that oozes a certain kind of spiritual and divine nobility. And the non-Jew may well sense it, dare I say, sometimes maybe even more so than the Jew, and sometimes they will certainly acknowledge it and they will admire it. President Adams himself put it, I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize man than any other nation. Many of the founding fathers of America and so many of its citizens were and are authentic Philo-Semites, cherishing, celebrating the Jew and his Jewishness. But alas, all too often, there have been those who will have loathed this uniqueness of the Jew, this ambassadorship, this light onto the nations. In 357 BCE, there was a Persian prime minister, Haman, whom we might all be familiar with from the Purim story. And he initiated, in his time, a final solution of his own, wanting to eradicate the entire Jewish nation. And he manages to persuade the then king with the argument, they're different than us, their laws are different than ours. And he evokes within the king that aforementioned ignorant hatred, if you will, an agitation. It's always easy to peddle that kind of hatred and get people on board. But Haman's own hatred, like many before and alas too many after him, comes from a much deeper place. Hasidic commentary observes, the entire Persian Empire always bowed to him. The only one who didn't was Mordecai the Jew. And we are told that Haman was filled with rage in his heart. It consumed him totally and utterly. Think about it. The world is your oyster. One man doesn't yield, and that becomes your whole preoccupation. That becomes your major problem. And yet the point is that, again, Mordecai's behavior, his own sense of nobility, exposes within Haman the reality that you are not all that special, that you are not the demigod that you think you are. It manifested a certain feeling of emptiness, which induced a deep-seated hatred. And then he had a choice, as so many since him have had as well. Deal with the effect or eradicate the problem. And so through the course of history, we have been hated on both fronts. Today, of course, for many, the battle cry has been one of anti-Zionism, which they insist has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And whilst for some, you can separate the two, for the overwhelming majority, the lines have become fundamentally blurred and reality speaks for itself. Because when a Jewish rabbi in Italy is stabbed on account of what's going on in Israel, when a Jewish businessman in France is beaten because of what's going on in Israel, when a Jewish professor is boycotted in the States because of what's going on in Israel, when a Jewish student is cursed on the streets of London because of what's going on in Israel, then frankly it's got nothing to do anymore with Israel or with Zionism or with so-called occupation, and it has everything to do with the Jew and Judaism and anti-Semitism. In fact, take the recent case of Jewish reggae star Matisyahu, who was banned when he was looking to participate at a Spanish music festival and told to sign up to a Palestinian state before he'd be able to sing at that festival, for no reason other than the fact that he was Jewish. You see, the international boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement, like many self-proclaimed anti-Zionists, insist that you can be against the policies of Israel without being against the Jewish people. And on the face of it, that may be true, but the hard fact is that Israel is known as the Jewish state. Its national flag has a Magen David, and Jewish people have always seen Israel as a safe haven from persecution. So whilst separate, the two are inextricably linked to such an extent that one is invariably seen as an extension of the other. And hence the question, so what motivates the boycotters and other Israel haters? Why, for example, does Israel get such special attention when it is the only democracy in the region, constantly attacked in an arbitrary manner when its Arab neighbors are massacring their own without any protest, without any boycott or condemnation at the UN? So we have this double standard with which the world measures morality. The UN, the academic world, the liberal voices concerned with human rights, the human politicians, the European politicians, the Stephen Hawkings and Noam Chomskys of the world, they're suddenly silent in the presence of the worst atrocities. And yet when Israel makes one mistake, and yes, let's be honest, it can make mistakes, it is condemned immediately, it is boycotted for trying to survive and not allowing its enemies to destroy it. And yet, just as one Jewish state is the target, when the crimes of its neighbors go unnoticed, so we can draw equivalence when one Jewish artist at a Spanish music festival is asked to explain his political beliefs when all the others are not. That these are double standards speaks for itself. Anti-Zionism is just the new 21st century name for anti-Semitism. You know, they tell of a traveling salesman who made a deliberate point of always going to a shul, to a synagogue to pray wherever he may have found himself. And once he found himself in Shropshire, in the backwaters of the United Kingdom. No synagogue for 100 miles. So he did the next best thing. He went into the local church on a Sunday morning, sat at the back, put on his tallit, put on his tefillin, and started to pray. The priest notices him. People are starting to come in. And he figures, okay, I'll do the diplomatic thing. And he says, right, well, all those who feel that they don't belong here, please leave now. And this guy, he's oblivious. He's just shaking away and doing his stuff. So the priest tries again. He says, will all non-Christians please make their way to the exit? And he pulls his tallit tight over his head and he continues to pray, at which point the priest bellows, all Jews leave now. Now the guy stops, takes off his tallit, folds it up, takes off his tefillin, rolls it up, tucks it under one hand, walks to the front, takes the statue of you-know-who off the cross, puts it under his other hand and says, come on, Bubala, we're not wanted here. Throughout the course of history, we have been told you are not wanted here. And many scholars and many historians, including many Jews themselves, choose to view this ongoing obsession with the Jew as not something uniquely connected to Jews or Judaism, but rather as a multitude of isolated events resulting from distinct circumstances. Arabs hate Jews because we are occupiers, that they hated us before 1967, before settlements, before settlers, that they initiated the War of Independence in 48 and by their own error resulted in a refugee problem, that gets ignored. Germans hated Jews because they were scapegoats for a depressed economy. Christians hated Jews because we supposedly killed their God. Stalin murdered the Jews because they were capitalists, whilst Europeans in the Middle Ages loathed the Jew because of his financial success. The hard fact is that anti-Semitism has existed too long and in too many disparate cultures to tolerate a claim that in each instance it is because of some distinct factor that has nothing to do with being Jewish. It's not a unitary phenomenon, a coherent belief or ideology. Or to put it in the words of the book, Why the Jews, economic depressions do not account for gas chambers. Jews have been hated because they were rich and because they were poor, because they were capitalists and because they were communists, because they believed in tradition and because they belonged to rootless cosmopolitans, because they kept to themselves and because they penetrated everywhere. Anti-Semitism is not a belief, but a virus The human body has an immensely sophisticated immune system which develops defenses against viruses. But it's penetrated because viruses mutate. Anti-Semitism mutates. You know, we all know the Ten Commandments were famously engraved on two separate stones, begging the question, was God short of stone that he needed to use two tablets? Why couldn't he simply put all the Ten Commandments on one long tablet? Somebody once observed, say what you will about the Ten Commandments, you must always come back to the pleasant fact that there are only 10 of them. Or as Zig Ziglar once put it, if God would have wanted us to live in a permissive society, he would have given us 10 suggestions, not 10 commandments. But the ancient rabbis suggest a novel answer. You know why it's on two stones? Because inasmuch as we have a typical horizontal reading of the Ten Commandments, they can also be read vertically as well. As much as we read them from top to bottom. I am the Lord your God, don't have any other gods, don't take my name in vain, remember the Sabbath, honor your parents, and then on the next stone, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear false, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't covet. That's the standard reading of it. But the suggestion is that there's another way to read it as well, and that is simply a cross. I am the Lord your God, you shall not kill. What message is conveyed? We can go through all of them and we'd spend a day analyzing a cross reading of the Ten Commandments, but let's just look at the first two. I am the Lord your God, you shall not kill. In the course of history, two groups have made an attempt to divorce one from the other. Commandment number 1 from commandment number 6. To sever the idea of God who conceived a world for moral purpose from the imperative of honoring life in another human being, and thus allowing the perpetuation of anti-Semitism and all other kinds of hate and killing. The first group were the philosophers of the Enlightenment movement, 18th, 19th century. And the second group were religious leaders in all different and diverse ages. And the result for both was always moral defeat. You see, the thinkers of the Enlightenment movement, well, they brought in an age of reason. The whole modern secular idea founded on the belief that the great ideal of you shall not murder doesn't require a prerequisite of necessarily believing in I am the Lord your God. As far as they're concerned, they can be God to humanity. Reason alone, without spirituality, without religion, would guide humanity into an age of liberty and would be able to still go on to achieve great moral purpose. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, could operate successfully without I am the Lord your God, without religion, which embodied the vision of man standing in a continuous relationship with God. The essence of the Enlightenment represents the vision of man without God. Left to his own vices, man can replace God. And then along came the Holocaust and put paid to that myth. The gas chambers were not invented by a primitive, barbaric, and illiterate people. Quite the contrary. They excelled in the sciences and the arts, and highly intelligent human beings who would go and gas 12,000 human beings and then return home in the evening to pet their dogs and laugh with their wives. As the smoke of children was ascending from the crematoriums, these charming romantics would enjoy good wine, beautiful women, and the moving music of Bach, of Mozart, and Wagner. They murdered millions of innocents in the name of a developed ethic, and they justified genocide on purely rational grounds. In fact, Elie Wiesel, who captured the world's imagination with his book Night, in which he described his own Auschwitz experiences, once asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe, if God exists, how could he ignore 6 million of his children to be dehumanized and to be murdered in the cruelest of fashions? And the Rebbe replied most poignantly, in whom do you expect me to believe after Auschwitz? In man? And here we are, 70 years on, and it is imperative that we take the message out there that if morality is left to be determined exclusively by the human mind, it can be a morality that essentially justifies the guillotine, the gulag, and the gas chamber. It is that same morality that will find justification for anti-Semitism, no less. And whilst the Enlightenment movement abandoned commandment number 1 in favor of number 6, other religions come along at whatever point in time, up until present day, and they abandon number 6 in favor of number 1. Theirs has been the ridiculous belief that as long as you believe in the Lord or in Allah, you can hate Jews, you can kill, you can torture, and you can maim whoever you brand a heathen or an infidel. Whether it is a Jew buying food in Paris before Shabbat, or magazine editors on the other side of town, or a teenager eating a slice of pizza in Jerusalem, or a Chabad couple in Mumbai, if this person is not of your faith, then it is for him or her to die. For the religious fundamentalist, I am the Lord your God has nothing to do with you shall not murder. And that, frankly, is the greatest perversion of faith. Because to believe in God means to honor the life of every person about whom the Bible tells us was created in the image of God. The juxtaposition of the 2 commandments is telling us that you can't believe in God and murder or hate all at the same time. Because what confers value upon human life if not the living presence of God imprinted upon the face of every human being? We all have to live with the objective of striving to be in His image. Our lives are all different and yet the same. And if we all respected that reality, if you really believe that you are God's child about yourself, then you would believe that about others as well, because you do know that God has many children. Now let's be very clear. There's nothing wrong to have pride in your own nationality and heritage. Frenchmen, Germans, Americans, Jews, Muslims, every one of them has a heritage. And there's a certain virtue to being subjective about your own heritage. I am especially proud of my ancestry, of my people. In fact, and think about this, to be a pious and fervent follower of any religion by definition means to believe that you are in possession of an absolute truth that has an advantage over all other religions. Otherwise, you have no reason to adhere to it with all your mind and soul. And that's okay. The only problem is when it spills over and gets to a point of excess, where it's no longer about being proud of your ancestry, but turns into a lack of respect for others. The philosopher Nietzsche famously said, the world is beautiful, but has a disease called man. And whilst there seems to be some men with diseased mindsets, ideologies, and attitudes to life of their own making, Judaism insists that the precise beauty of the world is made up of those who were made in the image of their Creator. In fact, the only difference between those who look to build and those who seek destruction, between those who love humanity and those who breed hatred, lies in their perception of the world. The ability to see beauty in the world is the beginning of our moral sensibility, because what we believe is beautiful, we will not wantonly destroy. And whom we believe are beautiful, we will not wantonly hate. This then brings me to the next point, the effects of anti-Semitism. You know, there's a curious story in the Torah where we're told about the 2 sons of Isaac, Jacob and Esau. And the Torah relates the story how Isaac wanted to confer blessings on Esau, the malevolent son, whilst Rebekah wanted to ensure that Jacob would get the blessings. And in the end, taking advantage of Isaac's vision impairment, Jacob disguises himself like Esau, such that when he presents himself before his father, Isaac declares, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." Here's how I understand the story. Isaac, one of our forefathers, the progenitor of the Jewish nation, felt that in order for the Jewish people to survive, they will not only need the depth and the moral stature and ambassadorship of Jacob, but also the hands of Esau, the abilities of Esau to be able to stand up against those who want to destroy them generation after generation. And he thought that maybe some sort of partnership can be established between these 2 brothers. One will be the moral voice, the other will be the protector, the defender. So he invests so much into the destiny of Esau because he perceives a world in which Jacob will be able to continue to nurture his spiritual calling, and if, and more likely when the need arises, Esau will be able to step into the fray. But Rebekah comes from that world, And she knows all too well that Esau cannot be relied upon to defend Jacob. She knows that 193 member states might come together as a United Nations to ensure peace and stability in the world, but it will still single out Jacob as a leading violator of health rights, as it did earlier this year. It'll still single out Jacob, Israel, as a violator of women's rights, as it did earlier this year. Despite being, again, the only democracy in the Middle East, Israel routinely faces more criticism and condemnation at the United Nations than any other country, especially those who systematically kill their citizens and deny them the most basic of human rights. Rebecca knows that Esau cannot be trusted as a partner in defending Jacob. You, she says, must go and take the blessings yourself. You must assume the persona of Esau. Be prepared to stand up for yourself where no one else will stand up for you. To be sure, credit has to be granted to those governments who have prioritized legislation against race hate crimes, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, etc. But ask yourself this: what does legislation do apart from suppress something rather than genuinely cure it? Anti-Semitism is not some virus like polio that can be eradicated by social and legislative medicine. But herein is where the world is making its biggest mistake, in simply not realizing that what starts with Israel doesn't end with Israel. What starts with Jews doesn't end with Jews. You've heard the expression, canary in the coal mine. Miners carry down this caged canary into the mine tunnels, and if dangerous gases like carbon monoxide would be present, then the canary would die quickly and the miners would know to get out. And as one journalist in a Canadian national paper wrote, Jews are the canary in the coal mine of human life, just 2 weeks ago. In other words, what starts with Israel doesn't end with Israel, as events all over the Middle East now prove. And what starts with Jews doesn't end with Jews, as the recent tragic events in Paris have demonstrated. Renowned American journalist Mary Brenner wrote an article in Vanity Fair in which she describes the riot which happened in Paris on Saturday, July 26, 2014, when a pro-Palestinian demonstration culminated with thousands of protesters chanting "Mort aux Juifs," or "Death to the Jews." In what she described as the summer of hate, she asked, how can anyone be allowed to paint a swastika on the statue of Marion, the goddess of French liberty, in the very center of Place de République? Anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with them. Stalin began with the Jews, but didn't end with them. Hitler began with the Jews, but didn't end with them. Make no mistake about it, it is our problem, but it's not just our problem. It does evolve into a global problem. Which brings me straight into what should be the legitimate Jewish response. Well, referring immediately back to the Jacob-Esau phenomenon. In the end, Isaac confers the blessings onto Jacob. And like we said, he declares the voice is the voice of Jacob and the hands are the hands of Esau. Isaac is effectively merging both realities into one entity. Yes, you must be the voice of reason. You have a moral calling. You must be ambassadors to the universe and never lose sight of that greater objective. But part and parcel of that calling is that sometimes you will need to use the hands of Esau. Sometimes you will need to stand up and defend yourself in every which way, because that is part of your global responsibility, an integral part of your ambassadorship. Because a world without room for Jews is one that will have no room for difference, and a world that lacks space for difference lacks space for humanity itself. Some argue that maybe we're better off just keeping a low profile. That has become the acceptable norm in many parts of Europe. Rabbis have been known to get up at their pulpits and encourage their congregants to just kind of obliterate any remnant of your Jewish identity when you're outside. I don't buy it. I maintain that when reverting to what the famous author Israel Zangwill once referred to as the ghetto shtup, walking with our heads down, keeping below the radar, then we're feeding into the stereotype. We're nurturing the germ. We're scoring an own goal. If the whole point and purpose of anti-Semitism is to reduce the Jewish people into oblivion, then surely we're accommodating the process when we choose to lie low, as it were. You know, I do, as was mentioned earlier, some television with the BBC in London. And some time ago, I met with someone in broadcasting there who told me how all those years ago, at the beginning of his career, he would always take off his yarmulke. He'd go to shul in the morning, do his tefillin and all that, and then he would come to the office, put his yarmulke in his pocket, and go up to the office. And one day, he meets Trevor McDonald. Trevor McDonald is like one of the most famous anchormen, news anchormen in the UK. Now he's retired, Sir Trevor McDonald. He's a black man. Going back 20-something years ago, they meet, of all places, in the men's room. Trevor looks to this young man, Charles, and says to him, "You're the guy from upstairs, right?" He says, "Yes." He says, "I have to ask you a question. I often notice how, because I come early like you do, you take your cap off your head and you put it in your pocket. Can I ask you why?" And he said, "Yes, to be honest with you, Trevor, I don't want to look different. I don't want to stand out. I just, want to be able to blend with everybody else." And Trevor looked at him and said to him, "Do you know," and again, bearing in mind how many years ago this was, "I am the only black person who works in this building apart from the cleaner. How do you think that makes me feel?" He said, "Every time I walk into the conference room, I immediately sense my difference over there." And then he looked to young Charles, pinched the skin of his face and said, "You see this? This is who I am. It doesn't wash off." Powerful words. With the ever-increasing threat of anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head again, with the growing uncertainty of what the future holds, with Israel living under a constant barrage of all kinds of terror, in the face of all of this, we Jewish people, we might grapple with our identity. We might feel intimidated, but we have to let those powerful words resonate with us. We have to remember that who we are and what we represent never washes off, and that the greatest, most forceful response to those pending threats that lurk out there is to stand tall and proud in our identity as Jews. Because to be sure, if you choose to conceal your own identity, if you choose to bend over backwards and be like one of them, then paradoxically, not only will this not solve the problem, it will only compound it. It'll evoke all sorts of suspicion. What do you mean you're just like me? I know that you're not. You're trying to deceive me. The non-Jew always perceives, as we said earlier, the uniqueness of the Jew. And then when the Jew tries to pretend he's something else, the non-Jew senses a lie, a conspiracy, and frankly, may well end up despising the Jew even more. It is only when you hold your head high and you respect yourself and you believe in who you are and what you represent that the world takes notice. We have to tell the world that with every ugly protest you hold condemning Israel, whilst simultaneously attacking Jews throughout Europe, we stand that much straighter. With every anti-Semitic, ignorant, malign hashtag you tweet, we wave our banner that much higher. And with every provocation you bring to the United Nations, hoping that maybe Israel will disappear, when continuously denounced on a political platform, we're reminded once more how fortunate we are to be Jewish. With every odious demonstration, every violent aspersion, every savage attack, every lie fabricated, every abuse, we are that much prouder that we belong to a religion, to a nation, to a people where optimism replaces pessimism and our faith exceeds our fears. The Jews, the miners' canaries, must always remain moral ambassadors of today's world. And by the same token, we should never, ever feel the need to apologize for our right to defend ourselves. Never let hate affect our idea of who we are, because pride is always a healthier response than shame. Let me just quickly refer you back to those aforementioned 10 Commandments. Just a simple question. Why were they actually carved on stone? You know, God can pick whatever ornamental material he so desires. He had the temple built with beautiful gold and silver and everything else besides. So why were the 10 Commandments themselves deliberately put on stone? One suggestion, quite profound, is that that very stone upon which the 10 Commandments, which forms the core of Torah, actually comes from a stone which Moses himself sat upon when he was battling against Amalek. When the Jews left Egypt, they were tired, they were weak, they were weary, and they encountered a hostile nation, Amalek, from which Haman descends. And Amalek chose to launch battle against the Jewish nation for no reason other than because. And God gave a subsequent instruction that every remnant of Amalek should always be eradicated all through the ages. Moses is sitting on a stone directing the battle of the Jewish people against the Amalekites until their eventual victory. That very stone later becomes the stone upon which the Ten Commandments are made. How does that figure? Ten Commandments, Torah, that's all about peace. This stone represents battle. And the answer is crucial to our response to anti-Semitism. Again, two types of hate. When hate is based on ignorance, on people who simply don't know what Jews and Judaism or about Israel or Zionism, then this sort of hate, yes, it can be reasoned with. But when hate is baseless, irrational hatred, someone hates you because of your very existence, you can't rationalize with that kind of hate. The problem is nothing to do with you and what you're doing. It's simply your existence. The enemy will give all kinds of excuses, but for as long as you exist, they will continue to hate. That's the sort of hatred that was represented by Amalek, who attacked this Jewish nation. It was a groundless, it was a baseless hate. If the Jews exist, Amalek cannot feel whole. With irrational hatred, it is impossible to reason. Hence God's directive. This must always be eradicated through the ages. Unless the Jew might seek to close himself up in his ivory tower or bury his head in the sand when facing these existential threats, thinking that somehow the problem will just go away, God insists that those very same tablets containing the Ten Commandments should be made of the very stone upon which Moses battled Amalek. The very Torah that advocates peace insists that you have to fight when necessary. And it is necessary when dealing with the malevolent and wanton hatred as symbolized by Amalek. Today, every Jew hater on the planet is slowly emerging again from his or her little cave or university office, or indeed plenty of governmental offices. Some of them are ignorant haters, but many are malevolent haters. And Amalek's hate is mad, it's deep, and we have to confront it, and we have to defend ourselves against it. We have to always ensure to secure our people and our homeland. We don't yield, we do what we need to do. The same Torah that speaks of peace is made of the stone from which Amalek was fought. Because the hatred of Amalek has nothing to do with anything that we're doing wrong. It is an essential hatred that has to be eradicated. And as a final point on this, what's interesting to consider is that all of Jewish history, of course, began with the Jews in Egypt, the Israelites as they were then known, making their way then to Sinai. And the first to encounter anti-Semitism would be Moses himself, because he suddenly comes outside and he sees a Jew in his first encounter an Egyptian beating up on a Jew. And he takes the necessary action. He, to use modern jargon, neutralizes the threat. The very next day, he encounters two Jews, and they call him on it. What, are you going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? All through history, there have been Jewish pacifists who will rebuke Moses for demonstrating leadership and sometimes taking the necessary action. But ironically, in the very next verse, we're told how Moses became very afraid. Now the matter is known. And then immediately afterwards, we're told how he's on the run. It's only when the Jew is afraid that he has to go on the run. When he doesn't respect himself, then others won't respect him either. We don't need to be pacifists. We don't need to be silent observers. Our greatest leader demonstrates that we need to confront the world with unwavering commitment in both the spiritual and physical dynamics of our reality. The voice is the voice of Jacob, and the hands are the hands of Esau. In the first instance, yes, we must certainly use the voice of Jacob, which will go a long way to dispel with myth and make enough of a difference, at least to those who care enough to listen. But alas, for all too many, you cannot use logic an explanation and hope to eliminate something that is founded on gross irrationality. And in that instance, we do not yield, we do not capitulate, we must never be afraid. They might wretchedly kidnap our boys, they might tragically kill our brothers and sisters, they might pitifully attack us on the streets of London or university campuses all around the United States, and we shed a tear, and we cry and we lament, but they cannot and they have never managed to break our spirit, not then and not now, because we intuitively feel that we, the Jewish people, have and will always prevail. So frankly, I don't really care what they say on CNN or the BBC or the New York Times. As Jews, we should never care and be concerned about being different. It's better to be a hero walking in one direction than with a crowd going in the wrong direction. I'm going to leave you with this final anecdote about a man who goes crying to his rabbi, "Rabbi, my wife drives me nuts. I can't live with her anymore." So the rabbi says, "Okay, if that's really the way you feel, then I suppose you have to leave." "But Rabbi, I love her so much, I can't leave her." He says, "Great, then stay together." He says, "But Rabbi, our common life is hell. She yells, I'm screaming, it's ridiculous." And the rabbi says, "Okay, if that's the case, then go your separate ways." He goes, "Well, how could we? And we have our kids and we love them so dearly." The rabbi thinks a minute and he says, "You know what? I think you should convert to Christianity." He looks to the rabbi and he says, "What? How's that supposed to solve my problem?" The rabbi says, "It won't, but then you'll go drive a priest meshuggah instead of me." We live in a world that challenges us sometimes to the core. Sometimes we think it's difficult to be Jewish. What do I need this for? The whole routine, the requirements, the ritual, the demand, it makes me meshuggah. And for what? Look around you, anti-Semitism at every turn. I put in all this effort just to get beaten up for it at the end. And yet, friends, that's the story of the Jewish people. Facing its problems and responding to them positively, refusing to give in to panic, to bitterness, and self-pity. We, the Jewish people, against the odds, are a collective affirmation of life. Our existence and our achievements are a living testimony to one of Judaism's greatest messages to humankind, the principal defeat of tragedy by the power of hope. It is impossible not to sense beneath our history the hand of God. And we have to put the message out there to the world, and perhaps even more so to our children, to the next generation growing up in this madness. A message of pride, of dignity, a message that has to resonate within all of us that declares loud and clear that Am Yisrael Chai, we the Jewish people, have, are, and will certainly live on forevermore. Thank you very much. Go ahead, yeah.
If the Moloch must be eradicated, how does one eradicate respected, tenured Professor Moloch?
Sorry, I could only hear part of the question.
If Moloch should be eradicated, as you say,
Yeah.
which is a good idea, of course, how does one go about eradicating a respected, tenured Professor Moloch?
A respected, tenured professor,
Moloch.
Amalek.
Yes.
The question really is he necessarily a Amalek, or is he an ignorant hater rather than a malevolent one?
He's really an Moloch.
Well, if he's really an Amalek, there's no process by which you can, as a Jew, eradicate him in the literal sense. But you do have a moral imperative to staunchly defend yourself rather than meekly capitulate to whatever baseless claims that are being made. In fact, sometimes you got to take the fight to him. Rather than, sometimes the best defense, in fact, most often the best defense is offense. So whilst we're often looking to apologize and often looking to explain and often looking to try and rationalize in whichever sort of way, they don't want to hear that. Sometimes it has to be taking the fight to them, like, how dare you and what right do you have? And I'm a human like you are human, and you have your interpretations and I have my interpretations, and whichever sort of way you take the fight back to him, well, in my experience, the bully always backs down when you stand up to the bully, not when you try to explain yourself to him about why you don't have your lunch money that day.
So as a follow-up to that, then why the comment of you don't care what they say in the press? I can understand the feeling, but how do you then eradicate that view without going on the offensive against the press?
Right. What I meant by that's a fair question. I'll repeat the question, yes. On the basis of what I just said, the question is, What do I mean when I say I don't care what they say in the BBC or the press, etc.? If you're looking to eradicate the problem, so what do I mean when I say I don't care about what they say? What I mean by that is that I don't care what they say in terms of how it's going to intimidate me. In other words, in as much as, and I suppose, and I'll just bring this up now because people do often wonder, is it so bad on the streets of London? To be sure, in Paris, quite clearly, it's pretty terrible. In Sweden, other certain parts of Europe where there are small Jewish communities, it's rough. In London, particularly, or throughout the UK in the main, it's really not all that bad. I don't have a problem walking anywhere within London with a yarmulke on my head without any fear or any trepidation whatsoever. And perhaps a lot of that has to do with the zero tolerance that's instituted by the police in terms of the crime, the race hate crimes, etc., that if you do attack, there will be serious consequences. There will be arrest, there will be imprisonment. In addition to which, I think it's fair to say that in the United Kingdom, the Jewish community are they're very close-knit. There's only 300,000 plus. And they're very well enshrined within industry and indeed within government. And they have proper structure like the Board of Jewish Deputies or the Jewish Board of Deputies or the Jewish Leadership Council, lobby groups that collectively and work together do the necessary lobbying within government as and when it may be required. Having said that, I also believe that here's the double-edged sword where anti-Semitism on some level is certainly institutionalized in the United Kingdom. It exists within government itself. It exists within different core institutions throughout the United Kingdom, and certainly very much so within the media. So when I say I don't care what they say, I mean in the sense of they're not going to intimidate me and they're not going to make me cower in the face of it. On the contrary, I will stand up to it, as I personally tend to do. They have a program called The Big Questions every Sunday morning. It's now stopped for a period of time, but I will have been on that program a considerable amount of time, and it's always really disturbing when I look back afterwards at the video footage to reflect on, wow, this is really sitting as a lone individual in a lion's den. And it's one thing when the Muslim on my left is going to attack, and I expect that. And it's another thing when a guy on my right is just an ignorant Anglo-Saxon and is going to attack, and I expect that too. But when the priest sitting opposite me starts having a go at me as well, I'm thinking to myself, we really are all on our own. And then, well, we could cower in the face of that, and that would be the natural instinct because it can be exhausting. Or you choose to stand up for yourself, not pay attention, not, in other words, be perturbed about what they have to say, but always be able to hit back. And for that, we have to be well informed in order to be able to, again, best defense is offense.
So if you view them as some of these, in your example, not the Muslim, some of the others as being the educated, ignorant, how do we impact or cause any level of change or understanding or just neutral involvement by those people against us?
I think every one of us might well find ourselves sometimes in different environments in which we know what's being said, if not to our face, whispered behind our backs, and that we can take the moral high ground in sometimes stepping into the fray, even when not invited to do so, to be able to combat the messages that are being put out there and to be able to clarify positions in situations of sorts. Again, in the context of the BBC, I could choose not to do it, but it's not just about the people sitting in the audience. It's an opportunity to put out there an argument that actually makes sense. And you know, because of the audience that's sitting there listening, it's all being televised live, but the audience that's listening to it suddenly start to clap along when the penny drops. Those who don't want to hear will never hear. But at least those who do want to hear, the penny does drop. And the 3-4 million people that are watching at home on their Sunday mornings, well, amongst them, there'll at least be some who are, again, looking to hear reason, and for them, the penny will drop as well. The voice is the voice of Jacob means that reason will always work, as I said, with those who care enough to want to listen. The others who don't, well, then we just have a responsibility to just continue to stand up for ourselves regardless.
Rabbi, if I were to ask you, in the UK, just from your experience, what percentage of maybe the anti-Semitism stems from the Muslim area, and what percentage would you say stems from the old-fashioned Anglo. Have you?
Yeah, it's a very good question. If you didn't hear it in the back, the question is how much of the anti-Semitism, say in England and the United Kingdom, is from Muslims, and how much of it is just the general anti-Semitism that is out there from the typical English community as such. People make a mistake, especially today when there's a lot of Muslim rhetoric against the Jewish community, a lot of protests, etc., that let us join ranks with, I don't know, the EDL, the English Defense League, or other such like. But the problem is, my enemy's enemy is my friend. It's flawed, because you can feed the alligator only on account of him eating you last, but eat you he will. And the bottom line is that that kind of hatred is mostly built upon ignorant hatred, a lot of it, and it's opportunists, and it's thuggery, and it's fashionable to swear at the Jew when you're driving by on the street because it's fun, but you don't even know what a Jew is, and you don't even know why you hate him. It's just, again, as I say, fashionable thing to do. But there are the deep core haters as well that have always existed and that are always there. And against that, there is the Muslim fundamentalism as it exists. Right now, thankfully, I mean to say thankfully, much of the mainstream English hater is too busy and too preoccupied with the Muslim hatred, because what starts with Jews doesn't end with Jews, and he's attacking them in the same way he's attacking me. And that's where they're preoccupied at the moment, and thus leaving me alone. But make no mistake about it, the English Defense League, as an example, if they were to eradicate that threat, or to put it very simply, there is a political party that started up, UKIP, a number of years ago, and they gained more votes this time around than ever before. And the party is built upon a very anti-refugee, very xenophobic policy. And maybe there are Jews within that party. There is a frum Chabad guy who was standing as an MP within that party. And I had strong words with him, and I said to him, sure, you think this will help you deal with the Muslim problem as it might exist. But Nick, make no mistake about it, once they get them out, if they're xenophobic, if they're racist, they're coming after you next, no matter what. So we are really stuck between a rock and a hard place in that regard. For the moment, as I say, we don't feel it because everybody's busy with fighting themselves, and we get to mind our own business in between. And we do have policy within the UK law that kind of protects us. But nevertheless, the threat is there, it lingers, it won't go away.
That threat's going to gain dramatically. We have a new labor leader, Corbyn, who's a virulent anti-Semite, and is that going to affect negatively the Jewish community since this occurred this past year?
The question was, we have a new labor leader in government, last name Corbyn, who is an anti-Semite. I'm not sure you're allowed to say that publicly on video because, well, there are enough lawyers here to protect me or defend me if that is the case. He's certainly profoundly anti-Israel, as he likes to claim, but his anti-Israel rhetoric is undeniably anti-Semitic, no question about it. I have no problem making that statement. And he almost actually would have lost his job today. It's rather disappointing to know that, as I learned just earlier, he pulled a fast one. He was going to do a 3-line whip and insist all of his own MPs have to vote against the suggested British war in Syria. And had he done so, there would have been a revolt within his own party and they would have ousted him in no time. But unfortunately, he gave everybody their own independent vote. That was a clever move on his part, such that I'm sure the vote will get passed to allow for bombings to take place now against ISIS, and he'll live to see another day. I don't really believe that he will make his way to the next election, but to be honest with you, you never know, because these guys have mastered the art of using the language that panders to the Muslim vote, and they're quite a vociferous minority that is ever increasing. Ken Livingstone, who was mayor of London, had the gall last week to actually say, in response to the current suggestion of going into Syria to fight, he said, well, and this is again on national television, he made a claim that the bombers you have 9/11, you have 7/7, the ones who went in and attacked the trains in London on July the 7th. The 7/7 bombers, quote, gave their lives in response to Tony Blair's mistake of going to fight in Iraq. That's the language that gets peddled out there by a former mayor of London on national television. Now again, thankfully that evokes enough of a response by the media as a whole, because a lot of people lost lives that day, and it's a horrific statement to make. But he knows a statement like that certainly panders to the Muslim response, and he wants to stand for mayor again. That's a nice way to start, sad as that may be. So Corbyn, I can only but hope, but you never know where these things go. If he did get into government, people, Jews, have expressed genuine fear for the first time in all the years that I've been there, and probably a lot longer, knowing that there is a man in government at the moment who could become the next prime minister that is an out-and-out Jew hater.
How do you deal with Jews who adopt the Palestinian line, the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel line, and believe Israel is an unwarranted aggressor?
That probably is our biggest problem. We are all too often our own worst enemies. And in fact, on one particular program on BBC on one Sunday morning, the guy who was arguing most passionate against me was a Jews for Palestine, or whatever he called himself, etc. And that's fair enough. You're entitled to your politics. But the language that he used and the way he had a go at me and etc. was just so utterly disturbing. In the first instance, I had to just compose myself. I had to suddenly think, wait a minute, but you're a Jew. And actually told him he should be ashamed of himself. And then went into the arguments, as it were. And he is a guy who simply doesn't want to hear any rationale, doesn't want to hear any argument. His mind is made up. They are, admittedly, in their own way, the hardest to deal with. Because if you talk about eradicating the threat, they're fellow Jews. They're not looking to eradicate my fellow Jews, regardless. I can put out the counter arguments against them. And unfortunately, the Jewish media gives them platform as well. So we have two main Jewish newspapers in London, or in the United Kingdom, the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News. Jewish Chronicle has about 25,000 circulation. Jewish News has about 36,000. I have a weekly column in the Jewish News, and at least that, and they will give a platform to these people who will write whatever they want to write and argue their cases, but at least I have my column so that, again, I have the opportunity to give balance and let the informed reader make their right choice. And I will have no hesitation, unless my editor sometimes tells me I have to tone down the rhetoric, to go after whoever it is that might typically be the one writing the other side, the Jew pro-Palestinian pacifist who is saying all kinds of things that is to the detriment of the Jewish people. Because they are always going to be the first people that all the non-Jewish haters out there are going to point to. You see, even your own agree with us. And then what do we say?
So Rabbi, just a comment and a question. We all get emails and everybody sends stuff around, and so I don't know when. I recently got an email in the last few weeks, but it might have happened a while back when Dennis Prager was debating at Oxford, and it was a tremendous email, and he gave a good account of himself. And then we checked out, and we found out that he actually lost the debate. He lost the debate to somebody called Avi Schlein, and he lost at Oxford 190 to 130. And I think Rabbi Yitzchok was on his side, on his team. They actually got out-debated, and it was kind of very dismaying, I thought.
Okay, if you determine the success or loss of the debate on the basis of the show of hands in the audience, then invariably you're going to lose no matter what. Because again, those minds are closed, and who wants to hand victory to those who are defending the Jews? So that doesn't necessarily mean they lost the debate. They lost the debate in the room, but did they really lose the bigger debate? And if that video is peddled out there, again, at least people get to hear the necessary message and the sound of reason, like you say, that is being put out there by Dennis Prager. So that's really where the success comes into it. So again, in the BBC studio, very often the rhetoric, the Muslim or the anti-Semite could make an argument which gets a huge applause from the audience, because that's what they do. They know by applause we're showing our support. And I'll make a comment that may make 100% more sense and get maybe a few hand claps. But does that really necessarily mean that I didn't make a sound point? No, it doesn't. And for me, the most important thing is not how many people are going to clap in the audience, it's how many people are going to hear what I have to say at home. Those who care enough to listen, the message will get through. Those who don't, we just have to keep battering the ram and never be ashamed of standing up for ourselves in every which way possible. Okay. Oh, okay, yeah.
Do you believe that anti-Semitism is a force that was put into the world by God to keep the Jews on a certain path for whatever reason? And if so, is there really a way to fight anti-Semitism from a secular perspective?
From a what perspective?
Secular perspective, political perspective.
Okay, the question is, do I believe that anti-Semitism was put into the world by God in order to keep Jews on the straight and narrow? And if that is the case, is there ever really a secular way by which one can actually defeat anti-Semitism? No, I do not believe that anti-Semitism was put into the world by God. As I said at the outset, the greatest gift given to man was free choice, and that free choice necessitates that a man who can make himself into a Moses can also make himself into a Hitler, and that man exercising his own free choice chooses to be an anti-Semite, chooses to hate the Jew. And although, yes, the prophets do say, and it is categorical, that when Jews mostly didn't get along with themselves, that's what wrought destruction, that's what resulted in the destruction of the temple, etc., etc. But the bottom line is, again, that's as a result of human action that brought something about. So ultimately, all these things, one way or the other, can be controlled by human action. In other words, if we say the Second Temple was destroyed on account of baseless hatred amongst Jews, then frankly, if there wasn't baseless hatred amongst Jews, there wouldn't have been a destruction of a temple, and Jews wouldn't have been exiled, etc. So ultimately, again, that was something within my own ability, within my own choice to control, as it were, or not, as the case may be. And so it is throughout the course of history. And I have a responsibility in the first instance on my own to stay on the straight and narrow or adhere to my responsibilities. The hard fact is that yes, anti-Semitism in a warped way does have a very real ability of bringing Jews together. It's sadly only when there are attacks in Israel and there's all kinds of devastation that all Jews do band together and unite as one. And when everything is quiet and peaceful, then, well, we have nothing outside of us to combat, so let's fight again internally. So that's a whole separate talk, and we need to redress that balance certainly as well. That unity needs to be maintained regardless, because when Jews stand as one, they can never be broken. Okay.
Thank you very much.